Good morning. Today we're going to be taking a look at Chapter 6. And one of the things I would have us do right off the top is to consider the meaning of Chapter 6's title, which is Inventing the American Republic, the states from 1776 through 1790. And the reason I would have us consider that title is because last week when we looked at Chapter 5 and we looked at the introduction to Part 2 of the book, we stressed the idea that in the time of the American Revolution, the English colonists who would become American citizens went from simply imitating what they had seen in British civilization and British political arrangements to becoming far more innovative. And that's really the thrust of Chapter 6. The idea that the states are going to be these laboratories of experiment when it comes to political innovation. So we'll be talking about in the first part of this chapter the state constitutions, the idea of societal innovation, working through some notion of equality, and how did that equality work? Was it strictly the preserve of white males, wealthy white males, or did it also apply on some level to African Americans and women? And then, of course, part 3 of this chapter, the idea of innovation in an economic sense. We're going to get a nice, fascinating look at the development of the American corporation and the idea behind patents and copyrights, both of which will help to protect this innovative spirit going forward. So Chapter 6 is very much trying to deliver on the idea that Americans became very innovative during the Revolutionary era, particularly when it came to the political arrangements, which is where the chapter starts. And it's important to realize that the chapter will kind of lay the foundation for what we will see in the next chapter, Chapter 7, that is the political arrangements at the federal level, when we talk about the creation of not only the Articles of Confederation, but also our second and continuing Constitution, the federal Constitution, the one that we still adhere to today. What was the inspiration for all this? Well, primarily it came from the states who had established their own constitutions during the Revolutionary period and provided the inspiration and the modeling for what we would see reflected at the national level. And that is really the focus here to begin with in Chapter 6. The idea that Americans at the state level during the time of the Revolution began to really take seriously this notion of a science of government, the notion that basically you could establish this kind of classical ideal of a democratic republic, something that we had seen in ancient Greece and in ancient Rome, that you could establish this now with some good Enlightenment thinking in all of your governments, all of your state governments, and that the state governments could then protect the rights of the people, something that was very important that the Americans had picked up from their experience as being British, the idea that the people are sovereign, the idea that the people have the true power, very much a notion that was well developed in John Locke's 2 treatises on government. So what we have is we have during this revolutionary era states effectively developing models or constructs for what a good democratic republic would look like, and then of course carrying that through by establishing those state governments as a way of declaring independence from Great Britain. Now there was enormous variety in how the states approached this, but eventually there will be some models that will be agreed upon. And it's interesting to note that over the period of the Revolutionary era, we go from a more simplistic design of representative government to one that is more complex, And that actually will provide the foundation for what we see at the federal level in Chapter 7. Now, from the beginning, all states realized that they wanted to break cleanly from their experience with the British, particularly their experience at the hands of British administrators during the colonial era. So there was a real focus on protecting the idea of free trade. Free trade was something that the Americans believed strongly in, and they felt that the best way to do this was to tear down the mercantile structures that had controlled them and controlled their trade. And so the idea of being able to trade in foreign markets was something that was enshrined very early on. The notion of being able to manufacture goods was something that the colonists had been doing and wanted firm protection of. And of course, this meant dispensing with the idea of royal governors and any notion of monarchy or hereditary rule. These were things that were seen as antithetical to any good Republican, small r Republican understanding of democracy. Republics, of course, were not problem free, however. And as we will see, each of the states, each of the colonies turned into states will see that there are a number of problems that they have to deal with when it comes to preserving that power for the people and creating that ideal of a democratic republic. And it is in this way that the book rightfully points out that the state served as a laboratory for the nation as a whole. And this is a critical concept, the idea that the states will essentially experiment in that science of government, in that Enlightenment thinking, and provide models and examples that will be later drawn from. Now, I mentioned earlier that there were essentially two broad plans of government that kind of took hold and seized the imagination of the early Americans. One of these plans was rather simplistic and straightforward. We can call it the plan that was inspired by Thomas Paine. Thomas Paine, of course, was the one who had been instrumental in pushing for independence with his pamphlet Common Sense. He had the idea that the people should be totally in control of their government, and so he felt that by and large this should be driven out of the legislature, that the legislature should be supreme, and that there should be this majoritarian principle that should be kind of enshrined in any good democratic republic, the idea that majority rules and would rule from the legislature. Of course, there was another model, and this model was inspired primarily by John Adams and also Thomas Jefferson, and it suggested that government should be made more complex. We certainly will see this in Massachusetts. The idea of complexity, the idea of levels of power, branches of power, will allow for the notion of checks and balances. And so what we get is we get eventually, by the end of the Revolutionary era, folks taking the Massachusetts model as their model for state constitutions. Massachusetts Constitution was something that arrived later than some of the simplistic constitutions that we saw with Paine. Simplistic constitutions that might well be reflected in a state like Pennsylvania, where the legislature had an enormous amount of power. Instead, Massachusetts had different levels of power: executive, legislative, judicial, and of course this allowed for checks and balances, which was seen to be a more complex mechanism for protecting the rights of the people, and that was critical. In addition to this, we will see in Massachusetts and elsewhere the idea that suffrage can be granted more broadly. The political franchise can be broadened. What that means is that more and more groups can be included in the governance of the state. And so we see some of the property requirements being loosened for participation in government. And the idea is the more groups that are involved in government from various levels of society, uh, you have another check on power, effectively. You have another check and balance system. So, in addition to the checks and balances enshrined in the Massachusetts Constitution by way of the executive, the judiciary, and the legislative, you now also have all these different factions that Madison will later speak of as being critical for kind of checking the power against what many people feared at the time, many of the founding fathers, and that is majoritarian tyranny, the idea that the majority could take control and could rule. So, as you see, we've drifted quite a bit away from the simplistic notion that Thomas Paine had with the idea of the legislature having all the power to a more complex level of government that allowed for a broader expansion of the franchise. Another element here, and it's so obvious to us as Americans that we almost forget to mention it sometimes, but it is extremely critical and very unique in many ways to the American experience, and that is the idea that a constitution should be written down, that there should be something that you can actually go to and look up as the fundamental law. This was the idea that you know Constitution reflected the sovereignty of the people, and therefore, if it was written, unlike the British Constitution, which was a collection of documents and traditions, if there was actually a constitution that was laid out, a full framework of government with all the checks and balances and all the provisions, then one could appeal to the Constitution as the fundamental law. And this was thought to really make good on John Locke's notion that essentially any good government, any democratic government, was essentially a compact between the rulers of the government, that is to say, the representatives of the people, and the people themselves. The notion that something could be unconstitutional would mean that it was a breach of that fundamental social contract that John Locke and others had been so adamant about in order to protect the people's liberties. There was, of course, the idea, too, that there should be a special set of elections and a special convention drawn up to create the Constitution. This idea that the Constitution should be created separately from the government so that it rules over the government. Think about it. If the legislature, of course, drew up the Constitution, then the legislature would have power over the Constitution, and that was not the idea at all. Instead, the Constitution was to reign supreme. So essentially, you have not only this idea of a written constitution, but the idea that a special convention would write it, and that, of course, the people would ratify it. And all of this is going to provide great inspiration for the national government later on. And the idea of having a constitution that is written down, that was drawn up by special convention, ratified by the people, meant that it could be used to effectively enforce compliance, so that if the legislature or the executive or the judiciary ever saw itself as being, above the Constitution, the people would actually have the ability to declare them to be unconstitutional and to have constitutional remedy. Very, very important idea. Another idea that comes out of this period and is reflected in places like Massachusetts is the notion that there should be effectively a Bill of Rights. And of course, this would be something that was critical in the British experience. The notion that rights of the people should be committed to paper and declared was a very, very important notion from British history and from the philosophy of a person like John Locke, who spoke of the idea of natural rights. And of course, these natural rights would be enshrined in the Bill of Rights. It would allow for another legal mechanism, something that the people could appeal to in order to effectively um, remedy the abuses of governing power. The notion being that the people would always have recourse in the courts to say that their rights had been violated, and these bills of rights were supposed to protect that. Of course, other elements of this period that had been gathering steam throughout the colonial experience was the notion of religious tolerance. Um, it wasn't so much that established churches were going to be done away with during the Revolutionary period, but the notion that um, established churches should not forbid other religious uh, beliefs and ideas to circulate freely. The revolution really makes good on the idea of the separation of church and state, because essentially by having the states grant religious tolerance, it put a certain check on the power of the established churches. Not that they couldn't have power, but effectively their power was limited. And of course, we see this reflected in perhaps the greatest uh, idea of religious freedom, the Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom, which, of course, Jefferson and Madison were responsible for. The idea that natural rights dictated that you would be allowed to have freedom of conscience, freedom of expression, and that would be in its utmost religious expression. That was really the key. So, as the book points out, there were a number of revolutionary innovations at the state level. But of course, it's good to keep this in perspective. Reading straight from the book here, they say few of the revolution's innovations were, in fact, accomplished in a minute. They happened over time, gradually, right? There were improvements in the science of government, and they were implemented only gradually. The Massachusetts Constitution of 1780, although heavily amended, is still in effect, making it the oldest still functioning written constitution in the world. And if we think about the Massachusetts Constitution as the byproduct of all these innovations throughout the Revolutionary period, and all the thinking that had kind of been percolating up as the Americans dealt with the specter of British control and British tyranny, um, it really is quite remarkable to see that, you know, the Massachusetts Constitution, the oldest constitution in the world, is still going strong in the state of Massachusetts today. And it is also worth remembering that, of course, it will be the Massachusetts model with its idea of checks and balances and other elements, religious tolerance, the relaxing of property requirements. All these things will become critical for what we will see at the federal level in the next chapter, the idea of a federal constitution, one that we still cherish to this day as well. Well, that's part one of chapter 6, and there are two other parts. The next two parts deal with the idea of equality and what did that mean during the Revolutionary era, and of course the idea of economic innovation. What happens with the notion of corporations and the protecting of the innovative spirit through patents and copyrights. Well, let's look over at this notion of equality. What did that mean? What could that possibly mean all these many years ago during the Revolutionary period, when we know that we were dealing with issues like slavery and second-class status for women? What could equality possibly mean? Well, it's important to remember where we started. Remember, the English colonies were a byproduct of the British Empire. And of course, in Britain, still to this day, the idea of an aristocratic still has meaning. But of course, in America, during the time of the Revolution, the term aristocrat becomes a derogatory one, which means that aristocracy is rejected. The notion that you would be born into some position of power, This is rejected. And the idea is that neither God nor nature had granted some people authority to rule others. That's a powerful idea, and it sets the stage for a constant questioning in this country's history over, you know, the idea of whether power is legitimate, whether, uh, the idea that uh, aristocracy might be taking hold. This will be a constant theme in the American experience because it will essentially create this idea that aristocracy is to be removed. And we will see this later on, whether it comes to getting rid of slavery later on during the Civil War, or dealing with some of the corporate power after the Civil War in the Progressive Era, or even some of the rights revolutions that we'll see in the 20th century. So, the first thing that we have to consider is that aristocracy is out. And of course, the notion of property and property rights will be respected. That's the way that you have a certain amount of equality in the early American experience, is to have this notion of property rights. And of course, um, generally, property allowed you to have a somewhat equal footing politically and economically, and even culturally, so that property becomes one of the ways in America that you're able to establish your relative equality. Um, of course, property did not extend in many cases to entire groups of people. We've mentioned slavery earlier, but we could also mention, of course, women. But the idea is that the elimination of aristocracy and the enshrining of property rights lays the foundation for some big changes later on. Um, of course, the notion of uh, possessing land, property, was something that could be accomplished in America by westward expansion. And of course, that will be a very important idea. And that will mean that more and more people will become, public office holders. And we will start to see that more and more types of people, not just rich, wealthy white men, will become in control of the governments of early America, certainly at the state level, but of course even at the federal level at a certain point. It is also true that in early America, we will have a very literate society developing with the proliferation of newspapers, which again will create this idea that people can kind of pull themselves up. They can become educated and they can rise in the ranks of society, something that is very much against the idea of hierarchy or aristocracy. Now, I know that it's very difficult to square this early notion of equality and property rights with the idea that we treated human beings as property. But as the book points out, when it comes to the issue of slavery, the Revolution brought the first widespread effort to dismantle the American system of black chattel slavery. The first assault was on the slave trade. So even though we're not going to get any real notion of emancipation or abolition of slavery, we do get the idea that slavery is distasteful and repugnant to the ideals of the Revolution. This will be very important as we move forward. So once the slave trade comes under attack, and eventually the slave trade will be banned at the federal level, then you start to see slavery itself come under attack. Now, all of this is happening very slowly, but in the northern states, by 1804, you will see that just about all of them have embraced some form of emancipation. So it is with the revolution and with the ideals of equality and the notion of government supporting the people and not the other way around that you will get this preliminary kind of move towards abolition and emancipation. Of course, this is going to be primarily restricted to the North, in essence, because the South was much more heavily tied to the idea of, of slavery, and slavery as being the backbone of their economy. Nonetheless, we do see that even in the South, but certainly in the North, there is an emergence of a free black community, and we will see that there will be some standouts like Benjamin Banneker, who, of course, is going to produce an almanac of science and mathematics and is indicative of this new Enlightenment spirit. Unfortunately, even in the North, and certainly in the South, you will have other scientific, pseudo-scientific notions being developed about race, and even Thomas Jefferson will not recognize the genius of Benjamin Banneker. So again, the story is a halting one. We have this discussion of equality that is brought up by the revolution, this elimination of the notion of aristocracy. But of course, it only goes so far. And its development in terms of dealing head on with the greatest inequality, the idea of slavery, well, that's going to be a very long-term project for the United States, and unfortunately have a terribly troubled history. But at least the seed is planted, and at least in the northern states, you have the idea of emancipation, and you have the idea that there can be a free African American community. Yes, racism was powerful stuff at this time, and will continue to be so, and perhaps even worsen. But generally speaking, the revolution puts us on a path that will eventually make slavery seen to be antithetical to America itself, and that's a positive development. What about women, of course? The other idea here is that equality doesn't have much meaning if women are treated as second-class citizens, and this is very true. Nonetheless, it's important to realize that one of the things that happens with women is that women are considered to be kind of the first teachers in the home. And we will see that there will be a attempt to have women kind of aware of Republican ideals and Republican characteristics. The notion was back then, and it's a very sexist notion, but it's kind of a first step towards women's equality. The idea that women should teach their sons as Republican mothers about the virtues of the Republic, and then of course the sons would go on to become the great representatives of the people. This left women very far behind, but the idea was that women were obviously thought of by the time of the Revolution and after as being capable of inculcating these Republican, small r Republican values. And of course, that will be very powerful stuff, and will kind of set the foundation for later women's education and the role of women as teachers and reformers in our society, and that will lay the groundwork for the women's rights revolution. So it's important to realize that a lot of things are getting started during the revolutionary period and at the level of the states before they broaden out to something that is more national in scope, and of course is able to lead to great change at the national level too. By and large, there are other developments that will be important to note from a cultural perspective. We will see that art will be expanded during this time, that there will be kind of a revolutionary art that will be developed. And by and large, Americans will want to develop a distinctive form of art, both in the visual arts and, of course, in terms of writing. And we will see that in many ways, Americans, early American intellectuals, just like we had seen with Franklin and the American Philosophical Society, were trying to essentially push back against this European prejudice that effectively said that America was incapable of producing any real genius, because everything degenerates in America. There was this scientific notion that the New World was lesser than the Old World in terms of what it could produce culturally. And of course, this would all be put to lie by some breakthroughs in terms of artistic endeavor that will take place during the Revolutionary period. Obviously, Jefferson and Franklin and others are a great refutation of the idea that there is anything lesser uh, about America. In fact, one might even make the argument that there was something superior about what was going on in America. Well, we've reached basically part three of chapter six, which deals with the notion of the economy and the idea of uh, you know the corporation and patents and copyright. And probably the best way to establish a little bit of context for this is to realize that in many ways things had been destroyed by the revolution in terms of the economy. There was a lot of property that was lost and destroyed. Paper money was something that became virtually worthless. The phrase was out there that nothing was worth a continental, which was essentially saying that it was worthless, and the continental referred to the paper money of early America. Of course, America was still heavily reliant on imports, despite the fact that once Britain was gone, we were able to focus a little bit more on manufacturers in America. It was difficult. It was very difficult because America was not in a powerful position, and so we still had to rely on a lot of things coming in from the outside. Nonetheless, we did have the West and Western lands that could be developed, and we did have a lot of uh, innovation that would take place, particularly along kind of the first thoroughfares of America. When we talk about areas where we had waterways and even some preliminary road systems, this will allow for some new developments and some new businesses to be established. And there will be kindled in early America a new interest in manufacturing. And the idea that perhaps some of these new ideas of machine power coming from the Industrial Revolution in Britain could be applied to what was going on in America. And this is where you're going to get some very interesting figures, such as Samuel Slater and others, who will effectively copy a lot of the innovations that will take place in Britain and bring them to America. This, of course, was something that Britain did not really want to allow for. They didn't want their trade secrets of the Industrial Revolution to be released to America, and so it was very much a difficult thing to get some of the designs, particularly for some of the early textile mills and other areas of manufacture for America. It was difficult to get these designs out of Europe and out of Great Britain so that they could be applied. But one of the things that we will see develop in America, no matter how difficult the idea of getting manufacturing going and developing a more modern economy, is that you get two great kind of innovations or institutions in American life. You get American patent law, which allowed for inventors to know that if they came up with something new, they could apply for a patent and have that invention protected. And that would be protected as if it were private property, that patent. And that was extremely important. The idea that intellectual property might actually be a natural right was a very important idea. And we spoke of natural rights in terms of politics earlier, but it can just as easily apply to some of the intellectual creativity of early America as well. Another institution that will be very, very important is the idea of the American corporation. And the idea of the American corporation is, as the book says, had the most far-reaching implication for the future economic development of the United States. Now, the corporation was supposed to be under the political control of the states, but in general, the corporation was more of a private affair than it was a public affair. Nonetheless, the states had to give the corporation the right to protect themselves in court, and that's effectively why you will have these charters developed at the state level to basically allow businesses to incorporate. And of course, the idea of incorporation means that if people put their money into the corporation, they they don't have to worry about being wiped out themselves personally. It's the corporation that becomes kind of legally understood almost as a person and stands independent. Therefore, if the corporation goes down, it's not as if all the investors are bankrupted. They only lose the money that they invested. And this is a very important idea. In fact, we will see incorporation take place not just in terms of what we would normally think of as business ventures, but also cities will incorporate themselves. And this also allows for a very unique system where you are creating these independent entities that have legal recourse in the courts because of the state charters. And this will allow for all kinds of innovations in terms of how to create profit. And of course, it also allows for some very innovative thinking when it comes to what businesses and manufacturers will produce. The idea that corporations can take risks on machines rather than traditional forms of labor means that essentially all kinds of ideas will be tried, many of which will be unsuccessful. But again, as long as the corporation is the thing that is bankrupted and not the individual investors, it allows for people to try again. And of course, we will see that the idea of incorporations and corporations and private ventures will extend itself all over the place. We spoke of cities earlier, but we can also talk about banks that will also be developed. Of course, there will be a question as to how much power the corporations have and whether the states really retain any power. Of course, the states were responsible for chartering the corporations, but do they have the power to regulate the corporations? This will become one of the great controversies going forward in American history. To what degree does state power or government power, how much power do they have over corporations and their affairs? So we have this great debate that Chapter 6 ends with, this notion of public and private, kind of competing to represent the real power of America. And of course, how do we make sure that the people are sovereign, that the people always retain the power? We started this chapter by looking at the state constitutions and how that was supposed to guarantee the political power of the people. We then looked at, of course, how the revolution kind of planted the idea of equality and the notion that power should be extended or recognized. The natural rights of others should be recognized, particularly African Americans and women. And then, of course, we end here with this notion of the corporation, the modern corporation. To what degree does the modern corporation serve the interests of the people, and to what degree does it perhaps subvert the power of the people? And how much power should the states or the government have over private things like corporations in order to guarantee the sovereignty of the people? These are fascinating questions, and all of which will become very, very important as we continue our study of American history, and as we see how many of these issues are dealt with at the national level in the next chapter when we talk about the creation of our federal constitution after kind of the botched experiment of the Articles of Confederation. Thank you.